can shift. Thank you, Liz. So welcome. It is really a gift to join you all this evening and be the facilitator for our discussion with Dr. Jane Ashby, focusing on teaching phonemic awareness in 2024, a guide for educators. Before we begin, I'm going to do just a brief introduction to share our meeting's format. This evening is brought to you by the Reading League New Hampshire, a group of dedicated, passionate, and really fun educators with the mission of creating a community that improves literacy outcomes for all learners. I, along with Heidi Zollman, am a co-president. With the board, Teresa Starkey and Bonnie Bell are co-vice presidents. You can see that we play well with each other. Holly Sturgill is our treasurer. Sherry McManus is our secretary. And additional board members include Danielle Cullinane, Liz Cannon, who is this evening's moderator, Diane Mellum, Debbie Dubriel, and Kristen Waddell. We're very excited to be here. To get the opportunity to interact with each other and with Dr. Ashby, here's what our meeting format will look like tonight. I'll introduce Jane, who will then speak to the big ideas embedded within the updated Teaching PA in 2024, a guide for educators document. It was released just yesterday in anticipation of this meeting. You may have received that as an attachment in your welcome email. And if you did not, Liz is going to keep dumping that into the chat so people will have that link and you can open that, okay? Then after Jane speaks to the document, we'll have an opportunity to talk with each other in breakout rooms. So Heidi is going to organize random breakout rooms with a few of us staying out in the main room. And we'd like you to identify a question or two in those breakout rooms or clarifications or wonders to ask of Jane when we come back into the large group. So we'll survey those Q&As. Liz has kindly created a document that she'll share at that point that we will be recording questions, concerns, wonders, and clarifications on. And then we will pose those to Jane and colleagues to answer those questions. So we want to get a lot of time interacting with each other and of course with Dr. Ashby. So lastly, I want to thank each of us for our learnings and being here together, because we will spend a lot of time being able to interact and question each other about what's happening here. Okay, so I am honored to introduce you to Dr. Jane Ashby, but the professor in the Reading Science program located in the School of Education at Mount St. Joseph's University. In this position, Jane helps graduate students understand reading research and its impact on reading instruction. In her previous position as professor of psychology at Central Michigan University, Dr. Ashby studied the cognitive processes that underlie silent reading by monitoring participants' eye movements as they read sentences. Jane has published several research papers and book chapters in addition to co-authoring The Psychology of Reading with Keith Rayner. Dr. Ashby holds advanced degrees in reading education from Harvard and from University of Massachusetts. And early in her career, which I always appreciate, she taught urban young adults who were struggling readers, tutored children with reading difficulties, and performed reading assessments at Boston's Children's Hospital. More recently, she's engaged with teachers in Ohio and Vermont in long-term professional learning. Jane's mission is to provide a bridge between research knowledge and practice knowledge, integrating these two areas to support teachers' ability to understand and teach their struggling readers. And I wanted to share that I first met Jane over a decade ago when I was working on eye movement section of Letters Module 1 in the second edition. And I wanted to better understand this research. Jane had graciously offered to meet with me on a weekend, no less.
Yeah, Thursdays on.
Brought my daughter, Michaela, then a teenager, to be an unwitting participant.
Talk to you later.
Okay, so I wanted to share that I first met Jane over a decade ago when I was working on the eye movement section of Letters Module 1, and I wanted to better understand the research. Jane graciously offered to meet with me on a weekend, and I brought my daughter, Michaela, then a teenager, to be an unwitting participant. Dr. Ashby hooked Michaela up with multiple electrodes in her hair, and I was able to watch how our conscious and subconscious processing interacts during silent reading. All she asked for in return was a dozen fresh eggs from our farm, and it was a deal I was more than happy to make. So it is with the same gracious attitude and enthusiasm that Jane agreed to join us today. Let's share a warm welcome to Dr. Jane Ashby.
Thank you, Carol. That was a wonderful introduction. I appreciate that. Some good memories back then, huh? It's been a while. It is wonderful to see you all here this evening. This is so exciting because it's such a wonderful format where you get the opportunity to interact with each other and to pose your questions. And I just wish there was much more of that time out there. So many thanks to the Reading League to bringing that forward. I'm just going to jump right in. I'm wondering, Liz, if it would be possible, or Carol, for me to share my screen. That would be great, because I just want to show, just in case everybody doesn't have it.
You should be able to, Jane, if you are the co-host there. Do you see the share screen green button on the bottom?
It is saying that host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, well, hang on. I will just see if I can change that for you.
Thank you.
Try.
Putting together the guide has been one of the greatest professional joys of my career. It has been such a wonderful effort. We come together every couple of years and we figure out what needs to go in there, and we banter it back and forth, and we try to keep it simple. We try to keep it useful for teachers. And I think several of the other authors, including the wonderful Lucy Hart Paulson, are here tonight. So that's great. And I've learned so much from working with all of these experts in this area. So that's great. How are we doing? I'm going to check right now. Let's see. There we go. All right, great. Thank you. All right. So here's our little guide. And I just wanted to kind of start with this cover. So we have, of course, our Alconen boxes, right? The idea that PA is both auditory analysis, but it's also realizing how the sounds are produced. And then down here, we have some different ways that people use chips to represent the different sounds. So I thought the easiest way to show you what is new in the guide and the setup of it would be just to look at the table of contents. So as dull as that may seem, let's just do that for a minute to kind of ground ourselves. So one of the things that's new about the guide is we tried to make it more teacher friendly by bringing the instructional routines up towards the front. Okay, so there's a little bit of yammering that we do at the beginning about research and blah, blah, blah. And then we get right into what some routines look like. Okay, one routine for teaching blending and segmenting, another routine for teaching blending, segmenting, and deletion. Okay. Error correction routines. So bringing all this stuff forward so that it's a little bit easier to access in the guide. The guide is not anything that's designed to read from front to back. You can if you want, if you're into that sort of thing. It does make for some very nice speech reading. But if that's not your thing, it's fine just to look at the sections and find a question that you have, like, do first sound activities have a role in early phonemic awareness instruction? And then you just open to that section and you're off and running. Okay, so in terms of other things that are new in the guide, we wanted to address some ongoing controversies in the field and try to provide some clarity about what the research says about should educators teach phoneme deletion and substitution. So we have a little discussion of that in there. Should phonemic awareness instruction use letters? That's another new piece that we address. And then also responding to pronunciation differences due to dialect. So how do we handle it when a student echoes a word that we say, but they say it a little bit differently? Okay, and so those are the key main new sections. And then we also have in the back a quick guide to speech sounds. which is a very nice explanation of why it's important to know your speech sounds, and what exactly a feature is, what phonetics are, and that sort of thing. So as we go through here, you can see the text is, so we're at about 20 some pages before we get to the references. It's not long. The text is set up to be fairly accessible. We've got our citations in there. We've got some endnotes. Here's some of the language for a blending and segmenting routine. We wanted to include this routine because several publishers now are putting out some programs that have you practicing blending with some items with kids and segmenting with other items. Okay, but you can get twice as much practice if rather than doing 5 and 5, you have the students do blending and segmenting with 10 words, right? They get twice as much practice. So this is much more efficient. So we wanted to put that in there, as well as talk a little discussion about modeling, the I do, we do, you do. So what is this guide? This guide is not a curriculum. It is not a set of materials. It is a support guide for educators so that if you have questions, you have a place to go, and you at least have this consensus of this group of authors in terms of guiding your practice, right? So whatever you're using in your classroom, if you're using Haggerty or if you're using some other program, if you're using EFRS, you can certainly use this guide to supplement and draw your attention to some of the finer points that might help make your phonemic awareness instruction more powerful. And Carol, with that, I think I'm just going to leave it right there so we have plenty of time to generate questions and have the discussion that we'd like to have.
Fabulous. Okay, thanks. Thanks so much, Jane. So I'm going to have Heidi put us into random breakout rooms for a number of reasons. One is that we want to just kind of unearth what our questions or clarifications may be. Liz had kindly put in a Google Doc that is called Jane Ashby Q&A, and I'm watching that over here live. People have already put some questions in there, but when you're in your small groups, please say hello to each other, introduce yourselves to each other, and then take a moment to talk about what are your questions or wonders or concerns, and then access this document. So be sure that you take what Liz has put kindly in the chat and link that open so that you'll have access to that while you're in your breakout rooms. Okay, and then add in some of your questions. We'll probably spend a good 8 to 10 minutes in our breakout room and then come back and spend the rest of the time talking with Jane, Lucy, and others. Okay. Any questions for the good of the group? Okay. Oh, and I guess there we go. All right.
Okay, so I didn't have the co-host go to breakout rooms. Looks like Wanda, do you need a breakout room? Okay, let me do that for you.
I love that. Simon.
Let's see where you are.
I'm speaking. My sense is that you could have spent a lot more time speaking with each other, and I'm really excited though that we get to speak with each other and speak with Jane. So I'm just going to moderate this by sharing some of the big picture questions, and as things come to you, if you've not had an opportunity to put it in that document that Liz kindly shared, please go ahead and add them. But we quickly looked and tried to group these, and one of the first big ideas that we want to address is the idea you've asked about, which is, how do these activities assist struggling readers? So Jane, would you take that one?
All right, this is such a great question because it really helps orient us to the big picture of why phonemic awareness is important. All right, and so, one of the things that we know from the past 40 years of research is that kids who have dyslexia and who struggle to read, the underlying causes are complex. And what they almost all have in common, almost all kids who have code-based reading problems have a problem in their phonological processing. How they process speech sounds is not as high resolution as the way we process them. So they sound okay when they speak. They can understand people speaking into them, but they don't really have like a super sharp focus on the speech stream. So they're hearing words in chunks, and it's really challenging for them to be able to separate words into speech sounds. Now, this is a new idea for all kids, so they need to be taught it, which is why the NRP recommends teaching PA in kindergarten and first grade. But for struggling readers, it's especially difficult, and they might need more extended phonemic awareness instruction and some more explicit instruction. So when we're teaching PA, what we're doing is we're sharpening the focus of that phonological root in the brain. And that phonological root in the brain, what is that used for? Well, it is used for decoding words that they haven't seen before. It is used for spelling. So thinking of a word, breaking it down into its sounds and writing. Okay? And it's also used for orthographic mapping to help students remember words as they decode them, because we don't want students who have to decode every single word all the time. We want them to be able to remember the word. And so the lower levels of phonemic awareness instruction, blending and segmenting, are very important for decoding and spelling. But for struggling readers, they don't build enough automaticity, meaning enough speed and have it be effortless enough to help with word recognition. So for that orthographic mapping piece to occur when students, after they decode a word, for them to remap the word, the letters and the sounds again, so it stores a nice little tight memory of that word, so that the next time when they see it, they can recognize it more quickly. In order for that to happen, the phonemic awareness analysis has to be quick and effortless. And that's why we do more extended phonemic awareness instruction with our struggling readers. I'm going to try to be more concise in my other answers, but I felt like it was really important to try to lay out those three areas: decoding, spelling, right, and word recognition. Those are the three things when you're working on phonemic awareness. You're strengthening the phonological processing in the brain. And those are the three areas then that are supported by that.
Thank you, Jane. You know, I'm often wondering and thoughtful about the national conversation focuses on reading only in a lot of these conversations. And you bring up an important point about encoding, right, or spelling, and the importance of the reciprocity between the two, reading and spelling, and the deep lexical quality that you can develop at the phoneme level, at the orthographic level. You know, when you spell well, then you're going to read more accurately and automatically. So we don't want to forget that, do we? You know, for sure, sure. But, you know, the next section, and I love that you and the authors have put the techniques and approaches up a little bit closer toward the front, because that's what people are really concerned by. So there are a number of questions you all have posed about the techniques, integrity lessons, and the ways in which we approach instruction. So I wondered, Jane, if you would address that next for us.
Sure. So I'm just going to go through three, and I just happened to spy in the chat that the amazing Lucy Hart Paulson is chiming in about early childhood. So if you are an early childhood educator, you want to especially attend to those things. And Lucy, of course, anytime you want to jump in, I can't actually see you on my screen, but I'll be looking for you in the chat if you want to chime in. And I also need to say that most of us, I think, we put together the guide because we have a consensus, but I'm clearly speaking for myself from my experience. and my understanding of the research. So I would never presume to speak for all the authors on the guide, because we're a bunch of academics, so we all have some varying opinions. All right, so let's talk about specific techniques about when you're doing phonemic awareness. So there were some great questions. One question was about 2 colors of chips or a different color for each sound, right? Phonemic awareness is so fun to teach because it's simple, yet the little details matter, okay? And I'm going to say this is a question that is going to be a depends question, okay? It depends, right? Personally, for the struggling readers that I work with, I find that 2 colors, 1 color for consonants and 1 color for vowels, is enough for me to see when they put down a sequence, whether they have, for example, the beginning blend represented, okay, or not. Other people have done more in-depth training with phonemic awareness, like with the Linda Mood Bell program. They're more accustomed to using different colored blocks where you have a different color for each sound. And that's totally fine. And that type of in-depth training we know is really effective for kids. I was not trained in that approach, and I haven't found that to be necessary for the students that I work with. Okay, but if I had a student who wasn't experiencing success with the level that I was working at them with the 2 color chips, then I would definitely consider going more in depth or referring them to someone who can go more in depth with them. And you can use, of course, 1 color. But the disadvantage of 1 color then is that you never really know if the student represented that blend at the beginning. You never really know where they are. If you use 2 colors visually, you can always see where that vowel is. Is it in the right place? Does it have the right number of sounds before it? Does it have the right number of sounds after it? In terms of automaticity, thanks for the automaticity question, that is so important, right? So being accurate is going to be the first step. And then as we provide kids with more practice, so I like to stay multimodal using tokens or chips as long as students are developing accuracy. And when they just get faster, they just get faster with the tokens. And then as soon as they're 90% accurate for 2 days in a row, then we can start either move towards all oral activities, so we can do more of them, or maybe half with tokens and half oral. And then move to the point where they're all oral. That's when you're developing the automaticity. So you want to make sure the accuracy is laid down, and then you want to work for the automaticity. I know when we're like with the past, it's a 2-second rule. To me, 2 seconds seems like a very long time. When I'm working with a student, that there's quite a bit of fishing around that they can be doing in that amount of time. So I think I want to see it, but see, this is bad. I'm not quantitative in that way. I'm looking for the confident response. It's not just a time thing. It's more like the confident response. But the automaticity piece is what's so important, because if they're not automatic, they have not yet solidified that particular skill set. Let's say you're teaching segmenting initial blends. They haven't solidified that skill set yet, and what that means is they're not ready to move on to deletion. And if you move on to deletion, you'll just get the house of cards effect, right? Where everything starts to get very shaky. And so you just really want to stay there until you're seeing that automaticity develop, and then you know you're ready to go to the next phase. There was a question about how much time should you spend with advanced skills like deletion and substitution. This is another it depends question. Now, first of all, let me just clarify that when we're talking about teaching deletion and substitution, who are you teaching those skills to? You're teaching those skills to students who can't do them. There's no point in teaching them to students who can already do them. So what happens is when you teach segmenting and blending to typical readers and they learn how to read, their phonological route starts cranking along, their phonological processing becomes very automatic because the reading and the spelling is reinforcing the growth in those phonological processes. This is for the typical readers. And stopping there is enough. But for the struggling readers, it's not. So when you're working with the struggling readers, you build segmenting and blending, and you see that decoding and spelling is improving a little bit, right? Once those phonological processes are strengthened, but they're still not automatic decoders. They're still decoding maybe the same word in several places on the page, right? That's the sign to you that they need more phonemic awareness work in order to make the root more in focus and to make the processes more effortless. And that will allow them to do the orthographic mapping to recognize words more quickly in the future. So how much time are you going to spend? Well, I would work it like this. I would work on segmenting. And then when you get to that accuracy in the small group, right, then you get to the automaticity. So let's say you're talking about segmenting initial blends, right? Then you could go next to deleting. So say play without the, right? And so you just transition that way. Then you would go to end blends. You would be segmenting end blends, right? And then you would go to deleting end blends. That's one way you could go about it. Another way you could go about it is to do segmenting initial blends and final blends. Then go to deletion of initial blends and with final blends. And then there was a very specific question about how much time should you spend with the internal sound in the blend, like what is play without the O. Okay, so deleting that second sound, pay, right? Deleting that second sound, or the penultimate sound in the word, the one before the final sound. Okay, and I just think, you know, that is very important. When students can do this, it helps their decoding so much. It is just really a crucial skill. And this is a big sticking point. 3 sounds for many students is no problem. It's as soon as you start to add those other consonants. And there's a reason for that. You know, we have a syllable. When we have a CVC word, we've got the vowel at the core, and the vowel signal is really strong. The transition from one consonant to the other, like in play, those two, they are really co-articulated very closely in time. And you have to have very sharp focus on those sounds in order to pull those apart. And so that is really important. Now, if I was working with tokens with a student and I spent several weeks on initial blends, like pulling out that second sound, I might start to wonder if building the word would work better for them or as an alternative approach. So say lay, give me the sounds in lay, A. And then now we're going to put a sound in front. And the sound is going to be, go ahead and put a chip right in front of that. And so by building the word, you raise the salience, the importance of that second sound, because lay, initially, they're tuned in on that first sound, right? Then you put the other sound in front of it. And sometimes that can help you. So you really need to kind of problem solve that and troubleshoot that. And that can be very tough, but I would not bypass that. That's super important to have that resolution. Okay, Carol, how am I doing?
You're doing fabulous. I wanted to add a little bit to that, that response, Jean, because there's a last thought about using letters versus tokens, right, or chips in order to represent those sounds. And that might fit in really nicely here when we're talking about students struggling, because there is a big push by some, you know, vocal advocates to suggest that we should not be using tokens. We should just be with the letters, taking the letters in and out. So I wondered if you would speak to that.
Yes, I'm happy to speak to that. Okay, we have done a deep dive into the research, and it's pretty clear, when this argument came up, it was very surprising because phonemic awareness activities have always been primarily oral. You're using tokens to support memory, right, for the word and the sounds, but they've always been primarily oral. If you look all the way back to the Lieberman's work back in the 70s, always primarily oral, right? But it comes back to that famous conclusion from the NRP that for typical readers, if you use letters, the effect sizes are bigger, okay, on reading than if you use tokens. All right. And it's really important to figure out what they meant by with. So this is a misinterpretation that we address in the guide. Okay, the NRP talks about 8 studies. In those studies, there were very few studies that used all letters. Usually what we're talking about is they start with oral activities. In fact, 80% of them started with oral activities, and then would have students, you have a couple letters there, and on some items you would say, oh, would you like to add a letter in for one of the sounds? So instead of using a blank chip, they're placing a letter. So if you recognize the citation Byrne, B-Y-R-N-E, and Fielding Barnsley, that's often cited when they're talking about the effectiveness of letters. So that is preschool, right? And you can imagine that if you're doing oral activities with students for phonemic awareness, and then you connect explicitly some letters in there so they get the idea that the sounds are mapping to the letters, this would really improve understanding of the alphabetic principle. It makes total sense. It makes total sense, right? We do not know this for struggling readers. There have not been any studies with struggling readers, NRP or otherwise, that have contrasted these two conditions, oral only versus using all letters all the time. Nobody has looked at that. Okay, so you've got some like new meta-analyses that claim like this, that, and the other thing, and that's a whole other rabbit hole to go down. But we don't have that data yet. So here's the way I like to look at it. I think about it as, why am I doing phonemic awareness instruction with my struggling reader? Well, it's because they're a struggling reader. And so their decoding is not very good, and it's hard for them to learn letter sound correspondences, and it's hard for them to spell. So why would I put letters in the task? All that's going to do is make the task more difficult for them. We're going to do plenty of decoding and we're going to do plenty of spelling, right? And it's all going to be done in other parts of the lesson, and that's going to be fine. But why would I put letters in there when that just creates a stumbling block for them, right? So if you are going to use letters, and we're pretty neutral on this in the guide, it's just like if you are going to use letters, here are some things that you need to think about. And the number one thing is that if you're using letters, those letter sound correspondences need to be known by every student in your small group. Otherwise, it's a barrier to their participation. And that's not what we're trying to do. So we're lifting the letters out of it in order to make the activities more accessible for struggling readers and to focus their attention more on the sounds, right? Because as soon as the letters are there, you know how they go back to that visual strategy, right? So we're doing it just to focus their attention on the sounds. That was a little long-winded, Carol. There we go, but that's what I got.
Oh, no, that was very appropriate and super helpful for sure. So I know that we all appreciate that greatly, Jane. There are a few questions peppered in here about assessment and how we assess phoneme awareness. What should we be assessing for what person, purpose, for whom? And a lot of what you're talking about is reminding me, and I think us, of thinking about the students in front of us, right? When we talk about phoneme awareness, it's not teaching something that a student doesn't need or is too confused by. It's knowing right where they are, the specificity with which they need support. And that's where we can drill down to really get the big bang for your buck. and data helps drive that. So what would you say about the data and what we need to be assessing to be helpful in order to move forward with instruction?
Yeah, I would say basically what you said. So you're doing your universal screening to figure out who might need some extra support. And then you're doing a criterion reference test, something like the Rosner. Very simple, 13 items, super easy. You can use it with everyone from kindergarten up through adult. Okay, and it starts with, say, cucumber, say it again without the Q, right? And it goes down to, I think the play item is one of the items for the beginning blends. And it shows you right where, so you're starting with the large grain size, going to the smaller grain size, and there's 2 or 3 items for each particular category, and it shows you right where they stop. That's where you begin your instruction.
So Jane, that's a logical thought. And I wonder this, right? Because we've really talked a lot about sometimes people getting stuck thinking that syllable work, right? Like, say cucumber without the Q, cumber. If students can't do that, then teachers go right to that level and spend quite a bit of time instructing when we know that's not a precursor to phonemic awareness. So I don't know, what would you say about that? And my then question about that is, why would we assess it if we're not asking people to teach that for the alphabetic principle? Help
I
us.
think that's, yeah, I think that's a great point. One reason why we would assess it is it kind of functions as a warm-up item, because syllables, literate and non-literate people can segment syllables fairly easily. Now, they might not be able to do the 3-syllable word. They can do the 2-syllable words pretty easy. And you'll see this with most kids. If you have a kid that can't delete a syllable once they understand the task, once it's really been explained to them with manipulatives, whatever it is you need to do, because sometimes kids have a hard time understanding the task, that's a different level. And quite frankly, I think that's a speech language level, right? You're going to start your phonemic awareness instruction with segmenting and blending 3 sound words, right? And you're going to start with just the first sound, right? So here are 2 words. Do they start with the same first sound or not? And there's some wonderful activities just in terms of categorizing pictures that you can work with children, so they get the idea that hat and hop can be in the same sound group, right? Even though they mean different things. And that's a wonderful place to work, kind of at the preschool level. But that's the gist, Carol, is that it's a warm-up activity. It helps them learn the task in a very non-threatening way, right? And then you can move on as quickly as possible to the actual phoneme level, which begins with first sounds.
Lovely, thank you. And I wonder if maybe in screening tools or informal diagnostics moving forward, we could put a little note there, like
Yes.
these, because we want students to warm up and make sure that they understand the task at hand. However,
Yes.
this is not for direct instructional purposes necessarily.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. I'm seeing a fun little question here in the chat, which is students who can learn PA with 2-letter blends, but have great difficulty with 3-letter blends. And that often happens. And I find that sometimes just waiting, I'm not really a wait kind of person, but in this situation I am, just waiting, because they've learned that every time you go up in the number of sounds, that's a huge jump in the burden and working memory, right? And so going from 3 sounds to 4 sounds is a big jump. Going from 4 sounds to 5 sounds is a big jump. Just hold off on those triple blends, come back to those a couple months later, and start there. And again, with some kids, you don't need to teach the blending and segmenting at all. You can just give a couple examples with word building, like trip, and they mark it out, okay? And then you say, okay, what if I was going to say the word strip? What's the sound I'm adding? And they say, and you say, where would you put it? And if they put it at the end, then you know you have some work to do. Okay, and if they put it at the beginning, you're good.
Fair enough. That makes great sense. Yeah. And when we're talking about assessment, there's a great little point here about emergent bilinguals. And the question, Jane, is at what point Is phonemic awareness assessment appropriate for emergent bilinguals? And is English assessment valid for newcomers?
Okay, that is a great question. This is not my area of expertise, but we did we had an expert author join us, and that's in section 3.9 of the guide. So I'll just address that briefly. It is very important for emergent bilinguals because there are going to be sounds in English that are different than the sounds in their home language. And they're going to have a harder time with those sounds. And students who have phonological processing challenges or a PA weakness in their home language are also going to have that in English, right? They're going to carry that with them, right? So it really does need to be addressed. And it is important in that section, 3.9 in the guide should really help with that. In terms of assessment, okay, it is always best to do the assessment in the child's home language, right? But sometimes that's not possible. And when that's not possible, we find that because it's not a meaning-based assessment, right, that you can get usable data by administering a criterion reference test in English, okay? So you can still get some information that way if you need to.
Great, thank you, Jane. So I'm realizing, just to keep us on track here, we have 7 minutes left. So I want to be sure that we're surveying everybody's questions here appropriately. There's a quick thread or question here about programming. I'm not sure. You know, I know Heggerty is as a program people have you know, mentioned often around phonemic and phonological awareness. Of course, Kilpatrick's and the 1-minute drills are as well. It's tricky, I think, to recommend a program, but that's a question that is asked here. And it's explaining that some teachers, of course, do find it easier to follow a program versus creating their own. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Okay, thanks for asking that question. Yeah, and we do recommend some programs in the front of the guide. My perspective on it is this. Look, if you are using Heggerty in your classroom, congratulations. You have taken a big first step in translating the science of reading and bringing it to all kids. And that is huge. It is a great starting point. And when you are comfortable to take the next step, there are other steps to take. All right. And probably the next step you want to take is to think about the NRP recommendation that there should only be 1 or 2 PA skills that you're working with children with at any one time. I prefer 1 myself. Okay, because you're only doing it for a short period of time. So rather than a kind of smattering of all these different level of activities, and I know it's why it's designed that way, it's because it's whole class, you know, all of that, but you want to move to more focused time, perhaps in small groups, working on just 1 skill at a time. We also have a sequence in here, so there's a possible sequence. Look, I don't like coming up with words either for my PA activities, so I think EFRS is worth the price of admission just to get the word lists and you get the sequence. And if you want to take a deeper dive into it and you want to do the training, there's lots of good stuff to learn. But meanwhile, there is those word lists and you can use those for your practice. You can use those word lists and you can marry them to the routines in the book, in the TPA guide. And you know, you can work it that way as well. All right. So the advantage of a program is that it's a great place to start. The disadvantage is it never really lets teachers maximize their knowledge and expertise because a program is never going to be as good as a skilled practitioner.
Bravo. Right. That's right. That's right. Because programs don't teach children, teachers do.
That's right. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So there's a quick little addition to that asking, is it appropriate for parents to do PA practices with students or their children at home?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Gosh, I have really tried to do some work in the field in this area because I just think it's so potentially important. And someone could develop some materials, but they would have to be really explicit because I'm always struck by, first of all, a phonological deficit is genetic. Okay, so that's one thing we need to keep in mind, right? Is that it might be challenging for the parents to do this work with their children. And the other part of it is parents are surprisingly, many of them, non-intuitive about how to work with their children in supportive ways, right? And so you might be very well-intentioned and not really adding something good into the mix of that kid's life, So for example, I would love to see, Lucy Hart Paulson, a book for parents with games and things that they can do with their children, when they are at that 4 and 5 years old range. That would be fabulous. That would be so fun. Put that on your list. She's got a long list. So
That's right. And Lucy is the person to do that for sure. That's wonderful. Would you mind speaking to statistical learning just for our last minute here? The idea, has often been mentioned that get in, get out, and just let kids read in order to statistically learn, right, and map words themselves. But I hesitate, and that concerns me because we're not providing enough explicit, direct instruction for kids who really struggle. So, do we really know what it takes to get a student to be a good statistical learner? And do we know how much they need to know before we really let them go? I mean, what should we say about that and think about that, Jane?
okay, so that sounds great, doesn't it? We'll just let the statistical learning machine kick in, and that'll be great. You know what? That works really great in Spanish. When you have one letter standing for one sound, the statistical learning machine in about a year can learn how to read anything, decode anything. Okay, but that's not our language. Okay, as we all know, this is not the writing system that we have in English. 26 letters, 44 phonemes, it's not good. Okay, so it's taking about 3 years for typical readers to learn how to read, right? So when people say, just let statistical learning kick in, they're completely right. And for some kids who already know how to decode when they walk in the door in kindergarten, that statistical learning machine is going to be kicking in by the middle of first grade. All right. Wonderful. My entire career is spent in that space before they get to statistical learning. I spend years with students trying to get them to learn enough of the pieces in the system so they can generalize, right? So they can bootstrap, so they are able to read new words independently and then store those words and connect them with other similar words, right? And this is just very difficult for many students to do. And I'll just leave us with this thought. If it was all about statistical learning, then we would have 90% of our children reading proficiently. Okay, we are not there. Okay, so it is not about statistical learning for many, many students. And again, it's the combination of the variety of backgrounds that students bring, how near or far their home language is from the language of school, okay, and their genetic history, their phonological processing, how much language interaction they've had before they come to school. And all of that together, plus pieces like attention, play a huge role, right? So all of that together just maps onto this very complex writing system to just make a mess. It's just a mess. It's just very complicated. And I would love to say that it's easy, but it just isn't so. And we just have to dig in and recognize that and just work as hard as we can to do what's right by those kids. And it's been such a pleasure to be here and to hear all of your questions. Thank you so much. I so admire the work that you do every day.
Wow. Well, thank you, Jane. We admire your work and your ability to be able to make this so easily accessible for instruction and assessment for all of us, because what good is the research if we can't really make it practical within our classrooms? So I'm sure you're seeing a lot of thank yous and appreciations. Please read those, Jane, and soak that all up, because you are so valued in our community. And I think I'm going to, this time, because you don't live nearby, I'm going to have to mail you a dozen eggs in thanks for this, right? Unless anyone else can think of another easy way to do that. As we close, I want to say that I'm so appreciative, as I know our Reading League New Hampshire board is super appreciative of the fact that you've chosen to spend this hour with us in good learning and in wondering and just being able to have a great conversation with Jane. We have upcoming events. If you're nearby, we have some that are in person, and if not, of course, we will have them virtual. We really are committed to making this information come alive in our classrooms and make a difference for children. So we will be doing things like showing Hopeville in Concord, New Hampshire, and you'll notice the date here. We'll also have a presence at the book festival, the New Hampshire Book Festival, our first. And what's really fun about that venue is that people were dumbfounded that there were people that are running the festival, that there could even be a population out there that struggled to read. They didn't know that. So we can't wait to bring that awareness to them so that we can help them become part of the force and stakeholders to understand how to help all of our children. We'll also continue a rotating basis in virtual supports. We are going to be doing the second Tuesday of each month for the most part, but this will all be on our website, the Reading League New Hampshire website, where we're going to be doing case study analysis. So we'll look at some data, much like Jane was talking about assessments. What is that telling us? One of my favorite passions, and I know it's Pam Kastner's here and others, is looking at students' misspellings. And they are a huge window into what students understand for language. So we'll be doing case study analysis 1 week or 1 month. The next month virtually, we'll be talking about IES practice guides, because there's lots of free information out there that is really laudable and it has been vetted by great researchers. So we will highlight that. We'll have Lisa Klein be talking about our writing practice guide in that month. And then the third month in our rotation will be celebrating the good things that are happening in schools in New Hampshire. So with that in mind, please feel free to join us. You don't have to live in New Hampshire to join us. It's only $20. But honestly, because of our mission, you don't have to join to be part of any of this. And we'll record it. We'll have the recording access available to all of you on our website. So just go to the Reading League New Hampshire. You'll see us all there. And we hope to see you all in many of our future endeavors with professional development. A special thank you yet again to Jane, to our board members, to Lucy Hart-Paulson. It's wonderful to have you here, Lucy, with your brilliance. Thank you for your help with this guide. And I can't wait to see how this all gets implemented within the classrooms. Thank you all. Have a fabulous night. I'll send your eggs.